The avoidant has maintained distance throughout the relationship, has withdrawn from every attempt at intimacy, has demonstrated consistent emotional unavailability despite your patience and investment. You have communicated your needs repeatedly, only to watch them disappear further into defended isolation. You have offered understanding and received coldness. You have provided support and experienced their retreat. You have maintained hope through countless cycles of brief connection followed by extended withdrawal, believing each return signaled potential for lasting change. Eventually, you exhaust yourself trying to sustain relationship with someone who cannot reciprocate adequately. You recognize that accepting their limitations means removing yourself from situation that depletes you. You complete the difficult internal work of releasing them, of accepting that they cannot meet your needs, of choosing yourself over continued hope for their transformation. You redirect your emotional energy away from them and toward your own healing and growth. You reach the point where thinking about them generates neither longing nor bitterness, but rather calm recognition that this chapter has closed. You are genuinely done, not strategically withdrawn, not performing distance to manipulate their response, but authentically released and moved forward. Then the avoidant senses this shift. They recognize through means that appear almost supernatural that you have genuinely released them, that you are no longer waiting or hoping, that you have become truly unavailable. This recognition triggers their final defensive maneuver, their last attempt to restore the dynamic where they held power through your continued investment. The avoidant, who could not be bothered to offer consistent presence throughout the relationship, suddenly becomes remarkably available. The avoidant, who withdrew from vulnerability for years, suddenly displays emotional openness. The avoidant, who dismissed your needs, suddenly acknowledges how they failed you. The avoidant, who claimed they could not change, suddenly promises transformation. This sudden shift appears miraculous, seems to represent the breakthrough you hoped for throughout the relationship, looks like evidence that the avoidant has finally recognized what they lost and developed capacity to show up differently. Yet this dramatic transformation represents the avoidant's final manipulation, not conscious strategy, but rather unconscious defensive maneuver designed to restore their sense of control, to reactivate your investment that gave them power, to pull you back into dynamic where they can resume their defended patterns once they have secured your renewed hope. They suddenly become everything you always wanted. The avoidant, who remained consistently distant throughout the relationship, who offered minimal emotional presence despite your clear communication of needs, who withdrew from intimacy with such reliability that you learned to expect nothing, suddenly transforms into the partner you spent years hoping they would become. This transformation arrives precisely when you have genuinely released them, exactly when you have redirected your life away from them, specifically when you have become authentically unavailable in ways that threaten the avoidant's unconscious sense of security. The timing is not coincidental. The avoidant's sudden availability manifests specifically in response to sensing that you are genuinely done rather than strategically distant. The avoidant begins initiating contact with frequency that contradicts their entire previous pattern. The avoidant, who rarely reached out, first suddenly sends thoughtful messages. The avoidant, who maintained defended distance, suddenly requests time together. The avoidant, who seemed barely aware of your existence, suddenly demonstrates intense interest in your life, your well-being, your current circumstances. This sudden attention feels disorienting because it represents complete reversal of patterns that define the relationship. The avoidant appears to have spontaneously developed capacity for consistent engagement that they claimed throughout the relationship exceeded their limitations. The avoidant also suddenly demonstrates emotional availability that was conspicuously absent during the relationship. They express feelings they previously suppressed or denied. They discuss their internal experience with openness that contradicts years of defended opacity. They share vulnerabilities they protected with rigid boundaries. They demonstrate comfort with emotional intimacy that appears to have materialized from nothing. The avoidant, who responded to your vulnerability with withdrawal, suddenly welcomes emotional depth. The avoidant, who claimed they could not tolerate feelings, talk, suddenly initiates conversations about emotions, about the relationship, about what went wrong and how they want to repair it. This sudden emotional availability includes specific acknowledgments of what you needed throughout the relationship that the avoidant could not previously provide. The avoidant articulates understanding of your needs with precision that suggests they knew all along what you required but chose not to provide it. They acknowledge that you needed consistent presence, and they suddenly offer exactly that consistency. They recognize that you wanted emotional vulnerability, and they suddenly display precisely that openness. They understand that you required reliability, and they suddenly demonstrate that very dependability. The avoidant's sudden capacity to provide what you needed feels like answer to prayers you stopped praying once you released them. The transformation also includes the avoidant suddenly prioritizing you in ways they never did during the relationship. The avoidant who made you feel optional suddenly treats you as essential. The avoidant who cancelled plans and created distance suddenly protects time with you as priority. The avoidant who seemed indifferent to whether you stayed or left suddenly demonstrates anxiety about losing you, suddenly expresses how much you matter to them, suddenly makes clear through words and actions that they recognize your value in ways they never did while you were invested. This sudden prioritization creates powerful pull because it represents what you longed for throughout the relationship, clear evidence that you matter to them. The avoidant's sudden transformation also involves demonstrating interest in your life that was absent previously. They ask detailed questions about your experiences, your feelings, your goals. They remember specifics about your life that they seem to ignore during the relationship. They follow up on things you mentioned, showing they actually listened and cared. They engage with your interests in ways that demonstrate genuine curiosity rather than obligatory participation. The avoidant who seemed barely present during the relationship suddenly appears deeply invested in knowing and understanding you. This interest feels intoxicating because it fills the void their previous indifference created. The timing and completeness of this transformation create powerful temptation to believe the avoidant has genuinely changed, that losing you created the wake-up call that motivated real transformation, that their sudden availability represents sustainable shift rather than temporary performance. The avoidance behavior appears to confirm the hope you maintained throughout the relationship, that they possessed capacity for intimate connection that their fear prevented them from accessing, that the right catalyst could unlock that capacity, that patience would eventually be rewarded with the partner you believed existed beneath their defended exterior. The sudden transformation seems to validate that you were right to see their potential, right to maintain hope, right to believe they could become the partner you needed. Yet the transformation's timing reveals its defensive nature. The avoidant did not develop this capacity while you remained invested, did not offer this availability while your hope sustained the relationship, did not demonstrate this prioritization while your patience accommodated their limitations. The sudden shift manifests precisely when you released them, exactly when you chose yourself, specifically when you became unavailable. This timing exposes that the transformation serves to restore the dynamic where the avoidant held power through your investment, rather than representing genuine development of intimacy capacity. The avoidant unconsciously recognizes that they have lost control, that you have moved beyond their reach, that the safety net of your continued availability has disappeared. The sudden transformation represents desperate attempt to restore that safety net, to reactivate your hope, to pull you back into dynamic where they can resume defended patterns once they have secured your renewed investment. The avoidant's sudden transformation also lacks the markers of genuine change. Real transformation requires sustained internal work, therapy to address attachment wounds, consistent practice of new behaviors across time, development of capacity to tolerate discomfort that intimacy generates. The avoidant's sudden shift involves none of this foundation. They simply begin behaving differently without having done work that would make different behavior sustainable. The transformation appears overnight, suggesting performance rather than development, strategic adjustment rather than fundamental change. The avoidant is demonstrating capacity they could have demonstrated throughout the relationship, but chose not to, revealing that their previous unavailability was choice rather than limitation, that they withheld availability they possessed to maintain defended comfort. They are now willing to sacrifice temporarily to restore their sense of control. They reveal vulnerability they withheld for years. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant maintained rigid boundaries around emotional exposure, refusing to share their authentic internal experience, deflecting attempts to understand their feelings, presenting defended exterior that prevented genuine knowing. You encountered walls whenever you attempted to understand what they felt, what they feared, what they truly needed. The avoidant characterized emotional conversations as pressure, dismissed vulnerability as unnecessary drama, presented their defended opacity as healthy boundary rather than as defensive limitation. Years passed with you accepting minimal emotional access, accommodating their defended position, tolerating surface connection, while longing for depth they consistently refused to provide. Then, precisely when you have genuinely released them and redirected your life away from waiting for their emotional availability, the avoidant suddenly displays vulnerability they withheld throughout the relationship. They share childhood wounds that explain their defensive patterns. They articulate fears about intimacy that clarify their withdrawal. They express feelings about you that they suppressed or denied during the relationship. They reveal internal struggles they previously kept completely hidden. This sudden emotional transparency appears to represent breakthrough, seems to signal that the avoidant has finally developed capacity to be emotionally present, looks like evidence that they trust you enough to lower defenses they maintained for years. The vulnerability the avoidant reveals specifically addresses aspects of themselves you spent the relationship trying to understand. The avoidant explains why they withdrew when you moved closer, articulating fear of engulfment or loss of autonomy that makes their patterns comprehensible. They describe early attachment experiences that created their defended structure, providing context that transforms their emotional unavailability from rejection into protection. They share their internal experience during moments when they hurt you, revealing that they felt overwhelmed or terrified rather than indifferent. This vulnerability creates narrative that makes sense of their patterns, that transforms their behavior from inexplicable coldness into understandable defense, that allows you to see their limitations as stemming from wounds rather than from lack of caring. The avoidant's sudden vulnerability also includes expressions of feeling about you that they never articulated during the relationship. They reveal that they cared more deeply than their behavior suggested, that they thought about you constantly despite their distance, that losing you created pain they could not acknowledge while it occurred. They express regret about their patterns, describing internal conflict between wanting connection and fearing vulnerability. They articulate recognition of what you offered and what they failed to adequately receive or reciprocate. This revelation of suppressed feeling creates powerful impression that the avoidant loved you all along, but their defensive structure prevented them from showing it, that their emotional unavailability masked attachment they could not express rather than reflecting actual indifference. The timing and content of this vulnerability appear designed, whether consciously or unconsciously, to reactivate your hope and investment. The avoidant shares exactly the emotional depth you longed for throughout the relationship, provides precisely the vulnerability you requested repeatedly, offers specifically the authentic connection you needed them to demonstrate. The vulnerability arrives packaged in ways that answer the questions that tormented you during the relationship. Did they actually care? Did their distance reflect fear rather than indifference? Could they develop capacity for emotional intimacy if they felt safe enough? The avoidance vulnerability suggests affirmative answers to all these questions, creating renewed hope that perhaps the relationship could work if given another chance now that the avoidant has demonstrated willingness to be emotionally present. Yet the vulnerability's strategic timing and convenient content raise questions about its authenticity. The avoidant possessed this capacity for emotional sharing throughout the relationship but chose not to exercise it. They could have explained their patterns while you were accommodating them, could have shared their wounds while you were patient with their limitations, could have revealed their feelings while you were investing in their potential. The fact that vulnerability emerges precisely when you have released them suggests it serves defensive purpose, restoring your investment, rather than representing genuine transformation. The avoidant is sharing vulnerability strategically to achieve desired outcome rather than sharing authentically because they have developed capacity to be emotionally present. The vulnerability the avoidant reveals also often focuses on explaining their past behavior without committing to different future behavior. They articulate why they were unavailable, describing their fears and wounds in detail, yet they make no concrete commitments about sustaining greater emotional presence going forward. The vulnerability serves to generate your understanding and compassion for their patterns, rather than to demonstrate actual development of capacity to modify those patterns. The avoidant wants you to understand why they withdrew, so you will accept their withdrawal as justified rather than as choice, wants you to see their limitations as wounds beyond their control rather than as defended position. They could examine and potentially transform through sustained difficult work. The revealed vulnerability also functions to make you feel special, to suggest that you are the person the avoidant trusts enough to finally lower their defenses, to communicate that their emotional sharing represents unprecedented intimacy they have never offered anyone else. This framing positions their vulnerability as gift that demonstrates your unique significance, rather than as manipulation designed to restore dynamic where you invest while they remain defended. The avoidant suggests through their sudden openness that you have finally broken through their walls, that you have earned access to their authentic self, that the relationship can now develop the depth you always knew was possible if the avoidant could just feel safe enough to be vulnerable. Understanding the avoidant's sudden vulnerability as defensive maneuver rather than genuine transformation requires recognizing that real emotional availability develops gradually through sustained practice and internal work, not suddenly in response to losing someone's investment. The avoidant who could not share feelings during the relationship has not developed emotional processing capacity overnight. They have simply decided that sharing vulnerability strategically serves their interest in restoring your investment. The vulnerability is real in the sense that the feelings and wounds they describe exist, yet the sharing is strategic rather than authentic because it aims to achieve outcome, your renewed hope, rather than emerging from genuine development of capacity to be emotionally present in sustainable ways. The avoidant will withdraw the vulnerability once they have secured your renewed investment, returning to defended patterns that feel safer once the immediate threat of permanent loss has passed. They rewrite history to make themselves the victim. The avoidant spent the relationship demonstrating consistent emotional unavailability, withdrawing from intimacy with reliable pattern, treating your needs as excessive demands, responding to your vulnerability with defended distance. The objective record of their behavior shows clear pattern of someone who could not or would not provide adequate presence despite your patience and accommodation. You exhausted yourself trying to make the relationship work while they maintained defended comfort. You expressed needs they ignored. You offered understanding they took for granted. You maintained hope through their consistent disappointment of that hope. The relationship's failure traces directly to their patterns of withdrawal and emotional unavailability. Yet when you genuinely release them and redirect your life away from waiting for their transformation, the avoidant suddenly presents entirely different narrative about what occurred during the relationship. They rewrite history to position themselves as the misunderstood party who tried their best despite impossible circumstances, as the person who wanted connection but faced obstacles that prevented them from providing it, as the victim of your expectations, rather than as the architect of relational emptiness through their defended withdrawal. This revisionist history serves to absolve them of accountability while generating your sympathy, to transform their emotional unavailability into understandable limitation rather than chosen pattern, to make you question your own accurate perception of what actually occurred. The avoidance revised narrative emphasizes moments when they did show up while minimizing the extended periods when they withdrew. They point to the occasional times they were present as evidence of their investment, conveniently forgetting the months of distance between those brief moments of engagement. They highlight the few instances when they met your needs while erasing the countless times they dismissed or ignored those same needs. They remember their minimal efforts as heroic attempts while your sustained maximum effort disappears from the story entirely. This selective memory creates narrative where they tried hard to make the relationship work rather than acknowledging that they maintained defended position throughout while you did all the actual relational labor. The revised history also reframes their withdrawal as reasonable response to your behavior rather than as their defensive pattern. The avoidant suggests that they would have been more available if you had been less needy, implies that they would have offered more presence if you had given them more space, claims that they would have shown more vulnerability if you had created more safety. This reframing transforms their patterns into reactions to your failures, rather than acknowledging their patterns as independent defensive structure that operated regardless of how carefully you modulated your approach. The avoidant makes you responsible for their emotional unavailability, suggesting that different behavior from you would have produced different responses from them. The avoidant particularly focuses on reframing your legitimate requests for emotional presence as pressure that justified their withdrawal. They characterize your communication of needs as demands that felt suffocating. They present your expressions of hurt about their patterns as attacks that triggered their defensive distance. They transform your requests for consistency into expectations that exceeded what any reasonable person could provide. This reframing allows the avoidant to position themselves as victim of your unreasonable standards rather than as person who failed to meet basic relationship requirements. The avoidant's revised narrative makes your needs into the problem rather than acknowledging their inability to meet reasonable needs as the actual issue. The rewritten history also includes the avoidant claiming they were more invested than they actually were, that they cared more deeply than their behavior suggested, that they were fighting internal battles you never witnessed that prevented them from showing up adequately. The avoidant wants you to believe that their external presentation of indifference masked internal experience of profound caring, that they were silently struggling to overcome their limitations, even as their behavior demonstrated no such effort. This narrative asks you to believe in investment that was never visible, to credit them for internal work they never actually did, to accept that their intentions mattered more than their demonstrated patterns. The avoidance revision particularly emphasizes their wounds and limitations as explanations that should excuse their behavior. They detail their attachment trauma, their fear of intimacy, their inability to tolerate vulnerability as if these explanations eliminate accountability for how their patterns affected you. The avoidant presents their limitations as if understanding their source absolves them of responsibility for the impact, as if you should have accepted indefinite emotional unavailability because that unavailability stemmed from wounds rather than from choice. The revised narrative positions their defended position as something that happened to them rather than as adaptation they maintained despite its cost to you and to the relationship. The rewritten history also often includes the avoidant claiming they tried to communicate their limitations, but you did not listen or accept them. They suggest they were clear about their capacity from the beginning, that you chose to pursue relationship despite knowing their limitations, that you cannot now fault them for being exactly who they said they were. This revision erases the reality that they minimized their limitations during pursuit phase, that they suggested their patterns were temporary rather than permanent, that they allowed you to believe they wanted to develop greater capacity, even as they demonstrated through sustained behavior that they had no intention of changing. The avoidant rewrites their role from deceiver to honest communicator, whose honesty you rejected. Understanding the avoidant's historical revision as manipulation requires recognizing that this reframing serves a specific purpose, generating your sympathy and doubt about your own perceptions in ways that make you receptive to reconciliation. If the avoidant can convince you that you misunderstood their behavior, that you contributed to the problems through your own patterns, that they were trying harder than you recognized, then you may question your decision to release them. You may wonder whether you were too harsh in your assessment, whether you failed to adequately appreciate their efforts, whether you should give them another chance now that you understand what was really happening during the relationship. The revised history creates confusion about what actually occurred, making you doubt your accurate perceptions in ways that serve the avoidant's interest in restoring your investment without requiring them to acknowledge accountability for their patterns or to do genuine work of transformation. They promise transformation they have no capacity to sustain. The avoidant, who maintained throughout the relationship that they could not provide greater emotional presence, who claimed their limitations were fixed constraints beyond their control, who suggested that expecting more from them was unrealistic given their attachment wounds, suddenly announces they can change when they recognize you have genuinely released them. The avoidant, who spent years demonstrating that transformation was impossible, suddenly promises exactly that transformation. They commit to therapy to address their patterns. They acknowledge their defensive structure needs modification. They express willingness to do the difficult internal work required to develop capacity for greater intimacy. These promises arrive precisely when you have stopped hoping for them, exactly when you have accepted that the avoidant cannot meet your needs, specifically when you have chosen yourself over waiting for changes that never materialized. The promises the avoidant makes address precisely the limitations that cause the relationship's failure. The avoidant commits to being more emotionally available, promising to share their feelings rather than suppressing them behind defended walls. They pledge greater consistency, assuring you they will maintain reliable presence rather than withdrawing unpredictably. They guarantee increased vulnerability, stating they will work to tolerate the emotional exposure that intimacy requires. They vow to prioritize the relationship, committing to treat you as essential rather than optional. Every promise targets a specific pattern that damaged the relationship, suggesting the avoidant has achieved comprehensive understanding of what needs to change and possesses genuine commitment to making those changes. The avoidant also provides seemingly concrete evidence of their commitment to transformation. They schedule therapy appointments, providing you with proof they are taking action. They read books about attachment, demonstrating they are educating themselves about their patterns. They discuss insights they are gaining about their defensive structure, showing they are engaged in self-examination. They articulate specific strategies they plan to implement to modify their behavior, indicating they have thought carefully about how to sustain change. This concrete evidence creates impression that the avoidance promises represent genuine intention rather than empty words, that they are backing their commitments with action rather than merely performing concern to manipulate your response. The promises also include acknowledgement of specific harm their patterns caused you, with commitments to ensure that harm never recurs. The avoidant apologizes for their withdrawal, promising they will communicate their needs for space rather than simply disappearing. They express regret for their emotional unavailability, committing to practice sharing their feelings even when uncomfortable. They recognize how their patterns made you feel unimportant, vowing to demonstrate through consistent action that you matter deeply to them. These specific acknowledgements and corresponding promises create narrative of avoidant who has achieved genuine insight about their impact and sincere commitment to preventing future harm. Yet the promise's timing reveals their strategic nature. The avoidant did not commit to transformation while you remained invested, did not pursue therapy while your patients accommodated their limitations, did not demonstrate willingness to change while your hope sustained the relationship. The sudden promises emerged precisely when you released them, exactly when you chose yourself, specifically when you became unavailable. This timing exposes that the promises serve to restore your investment rather than representing genuine commitment to sustainable change. The avoidant offers transformation when the immediate consequence of not offering it is permanent loss of access to you, suggesting the promises aim to eliminate that consequence rather than stemming from authentic recognition that their patterns need modification, regardless of whether you return.